click.
Very impressive.
And we're live. Right on time, too. It is Thursday, April 15th, 2021, 5 o'clock p.m. And I have a story to tell you. I woke up yesterday morning and I went outside. I was on my way to get my second vaccine shot. And there was a note under my door from a neighbor whom I had never met before. And the note was from two neighbors of mine. And the last time a neighbor had slipped a note under my door, it was complaining about the condition of our yard. So I read these things with some trepidation. But,
you're one of those people then?
I am. I once even had a note slipped under my door that said, "We don't live in Appalachia!" Exclamation mark. And I want to say, just as somebody, I know how to spell Appalachia, and the person who wrote the note did not. And I
dear.
Almost took a car and jacked it up on concrete slabs and hung a big sign on it, "Welcome to Appalachia, at least we can spell it." But I did not do that because I'm a nice person. Instead, I ignored the hostile note from my neighbor. This note was not hostile. It was very pleasant. My neighbor noticed that we had a pretty robust hand truck in our backyard. And she noted that she had a downed tree in her yard and asked whether she could borrow the hand truck and offered, by way of recompense, which was totally unnecessary, that we could have as much of the downed tree as she wanted.
There you go.
Because she also noticed that I have a lot of wood in my backyard because, as you all know, I do stuff with wood. Turns out the downed tree is a gorgeous maple, and it's quite sad that it has had to come down, but it was dead. So we organized an exchange, and I took 3 large pieces of the stump, and she has the hand truck for as long as she needs it. And so today, just about 24 hours after my second shot, I had to move 3 very large tree stump pieces from her yard to mine. That's a full city block. And I have to say, I was not feeling a whole lot of COVID shot symptoms until moving the 3 pieces of maple.
Yeah.
Totally worth it, but it really wiped me out in a way that normally moving wood would not. So for those of you taking Pfizer for shot number 2, if you are also going to move a dead tree, put a little distance between the two, because remember, folks, we are still not allowed to have fun anymore. Even if you think you're allowed to have fun, we're not allowed to have fun. We are, however, allowed to have Oona Hathaway, whose partner in crime you have met many times, Scott Shapiro. But Oona, we have never had on the show, and that is a gross oversight on my part because she is a super wonderful person. And I just want to say a quick word about Oona that has nothing to do with the substance of her work, which I always try to flag for people when it happens. Oona is a great mentor of serious people. And I cannot tell you how many people have come through Lawfare at various different times talking about the work they did with Oona Hathaway. And these include very, very young people who were not even in law school yet, but who knew her when they were undergraduates, as well as people who are active duty military who knew her at the Defense Department and when she was in the General Counsel's office there on a stint. And wherever Oona goes, there are really great people who look up to her, and whose work she cultivates. And I think that is just one of the coolest things that people can do. And so I've never had a chance to say anything about it, but I wanted to say something about it now. So Oona,
I second
welcome
it.
to the show.
I second that. Everyone I know loves Oona Hathaway and has nothing but wonderful things to say. And exactly what Ben said, just a wonderful mentor and like a real, and I mean, besides being a brilliant scholar and having an incredible body of work behind her, like that you're just a wonderful person. So
that's so nice to hear. You guys are so sweet. Yeah, no, that's lovely. Well, I will tell you that it's,
well, I'll message you where to send the check like later.
I know this is going to get expensive though.
So John Bordeaux in the chat reminds me of something important. Kate and I feel so strongly about the eating on the show issue that came up yesterday that we have actually arranged. It's the Saturday show. We're going to have dinner on the show. There may be guests. It'll be all finger food.
Ethiopian food.
It's going to be Ethiopian food. We have a guest who's going to be, but it's all going to be finger food. And so if you guys are, for all of you,
everyone who asked the question also has to be eating.
Grossly offended by Kate's eating on the show the other day.
I ate a bunch of blueberries on the show, and I was eating blueberries, and like someone like
Not
I got hate mail.
10 people started hating on Kate for this. And I just want to say, if you're one of those people, stop watching the show. We don't want you here. You're very unpleasant people. Oona, your work is diverse and it covers a huge amount of ground. You and I first ran into each other in the very early days of I guess probably at the beginning of the Obama administration over a variety of sort of drone strikes, international conflict issues. But so I was surprised actually when a bunch of years later, you and Scott wrote this, I thought, amazing book that was kind of the history of a set of ideas and how a group of people kind of came up with what we now think of as international. I mean, sort of, you call them the internationalists, but they're the concept of really regulating state behavior in an international context. And so talk to us about where the idea for this book came from and how you guys scoped the project.
Yeah. So thank you so much for all of that. So Scott and I started talking, years ago, and we began by writing an article that was taking on the question. So many people sort of say, well, international law is not really enforced. And if it's not enforced, then it's not really law. And so he's a legal philosopher. I'm an international lawyer. We thought, well, this is kind of like a cool project for us to try and take on together, to think about what does the sort of different way in which international law is enforced, like what meaning does that have for it being law? Does it really have to be enforced to be law? What impact does that have? So we started talking about these ideas, led to an article we wrote called Outcasting, developed this idea of outcasting. And there basically we argued is, international law is not generally enforced the way that modern domestic state law is enforced. You don't have police there to enforce international law. But we said it actually is enforced. It's enforced through this policy, usually enforced through this policy called outcasting, where what you do is you create this common benefit, and then the main enforcement mechanism is you take it away, the benefit away from the bad actors. So World Trade Organization, for instance, what happens if a state doesn't abide by its obligations under the WTO? You don't send in the WTO police. There's no, helicopters that come in and get you. Basically, what happens is you lose the benefit of the protections of the GATT. So the other state can countermeasure against you, basically break the rules back in the same amount that you've broken the rules to hurt them. So they can hurt you back at the same amount that you hurt them. That's a basic idea. And a lot of international law has this. A lot of international law is you break the rules, okay, you just don't get the benefit of those rules. So we've worked this all out. And then at the end of that, we're like, oh, we should write a book together. That was fun. Like we had fun working together. Like we should write a book together. And they're like, okay, well, what are we gonna write? They're like, okay, we're gonna do a book about outcasting. So we started playing with ideas about outcasting and various things. So
explain what you mean by outcasting, just really quickly.
So the outcasting is this idea of like, so in the article we talk about sort of ways in which international law has always been enforced through denying the benefits of cooperation from a member. So the article's a little bit crazy. It's hopefully it's sort of a fun read. It has some of Scott's influence, as you can imagine. So it has. One of the things we talk about is how in medieval Iceland enforced its domestic law without having any police. And basically, what would happen is
not just medieval, relatively recently.
Well, that's true. Yeah, right. So basically, if you broke the rules, there was a kind of law process. So they would have a legal finding that you had broken the rules, and then they would basically banish you. So they would outcast you, and sometimes it would be permanent outlawry, and sometimes it would be like a short term. So what happened when you were outcast was basically you didn't have any protections of the community. So people could kill you with impunity. Nobody was allowed to provide you support. Nobody was allowed to feed you, shelter you, etc. So they had a way of enforcing the law without having any police or jails or any of the things we think of as necessary to law enforcement. They just withdrew the benefits of being a member of the community because you broke the rules of the community. So then we started playing with, well, what are all the various ways in which international law does that too? And we also talk about canon law. So canon law, the Catholic canon, has something similar as well. So at the end of that, we thought, okay, we'll do this book. And then we sort of played with various ideas. And then at one point we realized, well, this whole article was based around this idea, this assumption that you can't enforce international law by sending in the troops. Like that you can't just go to war to enforce a treaty. So like, why can't the U.S. go in, when somebody breaks, like has an illegal tariff, why can't you send in the U.S. military to enforce it? Like, why do we assume that you can't do that? The whole article was built around the assumption that force wasn't an option. We're like, well, of course, Article 2.4 prohibits that. And then we're like, well, has that always been true? Has international law always not allowed? So it's international law doesn't allow you to enforce international law. Has international law always said that? And so we started just moving back and trying to figure out what international law was like. And Scott went and was like, okay, Grotius is the father of international law. So Scott, I was like, oh yeah, I've read Grotius lots of times. I don't know that there's much that interesting there. He's like, I'm going to go read Grotius. So he read it and he came back and he's like, this guy is such a warmonger. I was like, oh, really? Because international lawyers sort of assume that Grotius, he's like the father of just war theory. And like, he's a good guy, right? He's like the father of our field. He's like, no, if you read this guy's terrible, like awful. There's like all kinds of bad things that he's advocating. And among them, war is the main way in which international law is being enforced in his theory, like the opposite of what we have today. So we had the kind of opposite ends of the spectrum marked out at that point. Like, here's our world where international law can't be enforced with force. And here's Grotius's world where the whole theory of international law is founded around this idea that international law is enforced by force, like that all legal rights are enforced with military force. And then we had to kind of fill in how do we
how one got to the other
to here. Yeah. So
that's
then it was
a great
process
story
of like trying to unwind it and kind of unpack it and go back. And then we tripped across the Kelly-Briand Pact. I remember, so our kids, part of the reason we enjoy working together, our kids are the same age. So our daughters are now, I think they're both 21.
You look like 20 years younger than Scott Shapiro. I think it must. So I'm finding this hard to believe. It must be like Twitter has aged him prematurely.
I think Scott presents as an old soul, though.
He cultivates that look.
Exactly.
He really does. He cultivates it.
I know, it's true.
So I remember actually, I'd been doing a lot of reading to try and trade. I went from the present back, and he went from history forward, like sort of like kind of trying to figure out meet in the middle. And I was reading back and came across the Stimson doctrine in response to the invasion of Manchuria, where Stimson says, hey, we're not, going to allow you to change rules on the ground with force. And it referred to this thing called the Paris Peace Pact. And I was like, what the heck is this Paris Peace Pact? Like, I've never heard of this thing before. And it turned out that was the Kelly-Briand Pact. And so I remember showing up to pick up my kids from Scott's house and like telling him about this. And he was so excited. So that was sort of where we sort of began just kind of working and trying to figure out how that actually happened.
So I want to ask you about Kelly-Briand, because the conventional way you learn about Kelly-Briand, if you do at all, is that this is this very naive post-World War I idea in the sort of height of the foibles of the League of Nations. They actually had an international treaty banning war, and look, wasn't that cute? Only 13 years later, we have World War II. Oops! Weren't those post Great War French cute? And your account of it is much more respectful than that. And basically takes the view that there's a straight line between Kelly-Briand and the UN Charter, and that the UN Charter actually meaningfully does prevent wars. And so I want you to walk us through that and, defend the honor of Messrs. Kellogg and Briand.
Well, actually, Kellogg was a terrible person.
Yeah, he
like,
really was.
Totally awful, like horrible human being. And Briand wasn't so great himself. I mean, he was not as bad as Kellogg. Kellogg, he like swears, he's like nasty. He's like trying to prevent this thing from happening. They're each kind of trying to box one another in. So they were very like, part of the fun in writing this story was like discovering how like people you thought were wonderful turn out to be like horrible human beings. And like sometimes they do good things despite themselves. And so the Kelly-Briand Pact, what we argue is like, so obviously we had learned it the same way everybody else had, which is like, this is like the signal example of how ridiculous international law can be. I mean, what were they thinking? A treaty to outlaw war between the Great World Wars, like completely ridiculous. This just shows how useless international law is. And so when we tripped across all these references to the Kelly-Briand Pact, we're like, that's interesting. Like, I thought this was a total joke. Like, they're treating it as if it's like real. And so we started like looking into it further. And what we discovered is like, it was the most ratified treaty of its time. Like is extraordinarily celebrated at the time. It was seen as this really important move. It was a response to an effort to try and prevent something like World War I from ever happening again. But the conclusion we came to was that while it was like this important document and the movement, it took this whole like non-governmental organization movement, like all these groups working together to try and get it both the agreement written and made available for states to sign, to get all these states to sign. But what they hadn't realized was how much the entire international system depended on the right to wage war and depended on war as a way of resolving disputes and righting wrongs. Like that was not just like it was not just like it was okay to wage war, but like the whole system was grounded in the idea that the way in which you enforce the rules is through war. And so when you pass this treaty that's like, okay, we're not going to wage war anymore, but you haven't really thought through like what is going to come in its place. Like, what are you going to do instead when somebody breaks the rules? Like, how are you going to enforce those rules? Like, what if somebody wages war despite the fact that they signed a treaty saying they were not going to wage war? Like, what are you going to do about that? And they really hadn't fully thought it through. And they hadn't realized that what they were doing is kind of taking the linchpin out of the system. And the whole system kind of falls apart. And they hadn't really thought through, like, if you're going to flip the right to wage war to a prohibition on war, and part of what we try to show in the book is like all the other rules of the system kind of flowed from that right to wage war. So if you have a right to wage war, you have a legal right to conquest, that you can't make it illegal there's no such thing as a crime of aggression. States have to remain neutral. All these rules kind of follow from that. And when you flip the core rule, but you haven't thought through what the implications are for everything else, what you've done is you've pulled the rug out from under the international system, and you haven't put anything in its place. And so part of what we try to tell the story of is like that dawns on them that they haven't really figured it out, like that they changed this rule, but like there's a lot of things they haven't figured out. And so the story, a big part of the story is like they're working out the intellectual foundations of what becomes our modern international order as they're trying to sort out what flows from the idea that war is no longer allowed. Like what else has to be put in place to make that work? And it takes them about, from the signing of the treaty up really until the dawn of World War II to kind of sort that out and figure out those rules. And then, of course, World War II happens. And the argument we make is that, therefore, they have at that point worked out all the answers to those questions. And so when it comes time to write the UN Charter, they now know that it's not enough just to say, no more war anymore. You need to have the rest of these rules in place, and they've kind of figured out what those rules look like. And that's why the Charter works. Yeah.
So I'm curious, coming out of the Kellogg-Briand Pact and this idea, and like World War I is like often called the first modern war, obviously, and like all of these kinds of ideas. But every major war since then has been really remarkably different in terms of the technology that it has used to wage war. And so one of the things that I think is super interesting is you talk about it pulling the rug out from underneath these rules, but I think simultaneously also the very definition of war vis-a-vis technology is completely changing. And so how you define what counts as war, not only from not even getting into the fact that like we have like the conflict in Vietnam and everything else, right? Like not even like kind of getting into that type of thing, but really like, although maybe we should get into that, maybe you want to bring that up, but like the idea of what technology does to war in the 20th century, I'm just so interested in how that underscores these international law definitions of what counts as war. And
yeah, absolutely. So one of the key ways in which that happens, one of my areas that I teach is cyber. And so one of the big questions we're trying to figure out is like, what does international law mean in the cyber context? Like, what is a violation of Article 2.4 in cyber? So I actually wrote an article with Rebecca, who you mentioned. Yeah. So on
automated weapon systems.
Well, we did one on the law of cyber attack. It was one of the first articles that came out on sort of like, what is the international law that applies to cyber? Like, how do we take this set of rules about what, what it means that say you can't wage war, Article 2.4, how do you then transplant that to a world of cyberspace where like things are not generally going boom, but you're doing a lot of destructive things? And how do we think about these rules in this like totally different technological environment? And, those rules are still being worked out. I mean, one of the key things one of the key conclusions we came to is that one of the problems that we run into in cyber is that generally the harm is not large enough to reach the threshold of Article 2.4 in the UN Charter, that is a prohibition on use of force. And so much of what's happening is so-called below the threshold. So below this Article 2.4 threshold, which means it's not regulated by the rules that generally regulate the use of force. And so part of the problem that we're facing is that this is a body of law that we haven't really had to answer these questions so much before, because technology now has opened up this space that you can do so many of these aggressive actions in cyberspace below the Article 2.4 threshold, and we just haven't had cause to kind of work out what those rules look like before. And so we're kind of having to figure it out on the fly, as things are happening. I mean, today there was the sanctions for solar winds against Russia, and one of the key ways in which the U.S. is dealing with this is basically saying, hey, we're gonna just put in place sanctions, and we're gonna put in place travel restrictions, and we're gonna do indictments, and we're not going to treat this like war. We're going to treat this like criminal activity instead. So, but you're right. I mean, technology totally challenges all of this. Drones too, because drones are strange in that it allows you to project force around the world 24/7, and your own people are never at risk.
Well, and to that point, sanctions have long been criticized because they put civilians and individual people that are like just through like acts of God and circumstance members of a certain nation, and then it like denies them access to food and medicine and other types of things. And so like those are using them as enforcement mechanisms has like always been controversial, because you're not punishing a government necessarily, you're punishing a people. And if you have an autocratic kind of or oligarchic kind of like structure, the people at the top are always going to be fine, and you punish the people that are just there because of circumstance.
100%. And that has been one of the big and really effective critiques of sanctions. For instance, the childhood death rate in Iraq skyrocketed during U.S. sanctions, and lots of people not able to get adequate food or medicine, really horrific effects. What I would say is, and we talk a little bit about this in the book, is that sanctions technology has gotten a lot better over the last several decades, and we're increasingly able to target sanctions at the particular people who are responsible for the policy. And so like that is much better, I think, than the problem you're describing, because you can go at like the people actually who crafted the policy and say like, you want to go to your like multi-million-dollar flat in London or in New York, you can't anymore. And, you want to travel to see your kids at Oxford or Yale or Harvard, you can't anymore. Right. So and that actually has, that actually hits the people you want to hit rather than the people you don't want to hit. And I do think that is a really important innovation in sanctions technology, and one that, the U.S. has really been in the leadership on that. I think that's been really an important development in sanctions technology, and I think we need to do a lot more of that. But what you're describing still is a problem. I mean, this is a problem in Iran right now. There were a lot of people said, look, the U.S. sanctions against Iran was making the COVID crisis way worse because people were not able to get, adequate access to, oxygen and PPE and other things that they needed to be able to actually treat people and protect medical personnel from the pandemic, and on top of it, people not being able to get adequate food, et cetera. So yeah, it continues to be a problem, even though we now have these new technologies for more.
Thank you for introducing me to this notion of sanctions technology. I knew that those things existed, but I did not have a word for it, or like words for it. So that was awesome. Thank you so much. Christopher Argyris.
So Christopher, who has been agitating for Oona's presence for a while, we grant him
that's awesome.
Dog-eared copy.
The Genevieve de la Fera official question string here.
Yay.
So Christopher, the floor is yours for however so much time you may choose to use it.
That's great. You have the UK edition. I love it.
Yeah, I know. I didn't know it had a different title until I started to Google it.
Well, yeah, and you know what? That's because the British did not. They found this title way too radical. How a radical plan to outlaw war remade the world. They're like, well, that's way too American.
Yeah, I know. Just for the American audience, the British one says, "and their plan to outlaw war," which
wow,
typical British understatement.
Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
So I gave a talk in Germany this morning, like in a ridiculous hour from my bathroom. And when I was giving a talk and I said something about like preemptory strikes and like all of this type of, and like people seemed like, they were like, wow, that's a lot of like strong language. And I was like, is
Really?
it? Like, I mean, I'm being metaphorical. Like, I'm not like being serious about like Facebook having preemptory strikes.
Yeah.
Is this a thing? Like, I don't know.
You know, I all I know is that we had long conversations with our publisher, and they were very much of the view that this was that how a radical plan to outlaw war remade the world was way too like aggressive of a title. So I don't know if that's a general thing. Maybe some of the listeners will be able to tell us, and if we have listeners, you know, who have a view about that. But yeah, no, it does seem that they value a little bit more understatement, and the Americans are all about like, let's just go for it.
So Oona, the backstory for me having the book in the UK was that I met Scott when he was doing his visiting professorship in the summer at UCL. So
Yeah.
So I knew
Great.
Scott before this, also before his persona on in lieu of fun, and the only thing that I thought was a little different about him was in our like small lecture, he was sitting on a chair. I don't know what the PC term would be, but we used to say Indian style.
He's perched. He perches. Yeah, he's like a little bird. Yeah.
Perched on the chair. So yeah. All right. So my first question would be, what is the utility of the Security Council mechanism for legal war when that's very rarely followed through on these days, and most countries doing any kind of military action would just invoke Article 51 self-defense, even if it's a preemptive strike?
Yeah, I mean, you point to a big problem. So, I mean, for those who maybe don't know as much about the Security Council, just like a little bit of background. So there's the prohibition on going to war, and there's just very limited exceptions. So the exceptions include under Chapter 7, you can get authority from the Security Council. Security Council votes on it. And the 5 permanent members can all veto that. So US, Russia, China, UK, France. And so you have to get Russia, China, and the US to agree in particular. Those are the hard ones. So for instance, US wanted to do something about the chaos and humanitarian crisis in Syria. Russia, of course, vetoed it, and China went along with the veto as well. So it's very hard to get authority under Chapter 7 ever to intervene to address violations of the peace. There have been some, so the intervention in Libya to address the breakdown there with what was believed to be a humanitarian crisis was authorized by the Security Council. So you actually did have all of the members allow it to go ahead. And some think that in part because there, at least some argue that intervention exceeded the scope of what the Security Council authorized, and that's part of the reason China goes along with Russia in refusing to allow intervention in Syria. But putting that to one side, so that is hard. It's not that it never happens; it does happen, but it's harder to get it through because you have to get these states that don't agree on very much to agree. And then the other exception is Article 51, which you mentioned. So Article 51 basically says, hey, you don't lose your right of self-defense. Like if you get attacked, you can respond. And as you rightly point out, states have been increasingly interpreting things as falling within Article 51 more and more and more. And so there are a lot more instances where states are taking action, and then they're claiming that they're doing it under self-defense. So just to give an example, U.S. Military operations throughout the Middle East right now are happening under many of them, not all of them, but many of them are happening under Article 51. So U.S. interventions in Syria, for instance, are under Article 51. Some of them are under consent. So our operations in Iraq right now are with the consent of the Iraqi government. And I think you point to a real problem, and it's something we motion at the end of the book, but I think we could have said more, although it wasn't as far along as we now know it to be, which is that this exception is being expanded and expanded and expanded to the point where it's almost like the exception is threatening to swallow the rule. Like if Article 51 is sort of infinitely flexible and you can kind of argue that anything is in self-defense, then the prohibition on use of force no longer has any meaning. And that's something I do worry a lot about. And that's why when the U.S. makes what I think are sort of spurious claims to self-defense, I get upset about it. So the relatively recent decision by the Biden administration to strike the facility of non-state actor group affiliate or supported by Iran located in Syria, the U.S. Claimed that was an act of self-defense under Article 51. And a lot of us wrote after that saying, like, yeah, that's kind of a stretch. Like we at least from what we've seen, obviously not having seen the internal intelligence, it doesn't seem like it properly qualifies under Article 51. So, yeah, this is a worry. And I think the U.S. has kind of unfortunately been at the forefront of kind of stretching the limits of Article 51 in ways that are potentially pretty dangerous. So, unfortunately.
All right. So how has what you called outcasting helped to rein in and deter rogue regimes like Syria, Myanmar, North Korea, Russia, and China, who essentially wage war or subjugate their own people in an internal form of conquest and pacification?
Yeah, so we talk a bit about this. So let's just take one example. So Russia. So one example we give in the book is what happens after Russia seizes Crimea, so which part of Ukraine. Now, obviously, Russia is a nuclear state, very powerful state. So one possibility would be to send in the military, but nobody wanted to do that because nobody wants a confrontation with Russia or military confrontation with Russia. And so what the world coordinated around was a series of sanctions against Russia, pretty substantial financial sanctions, which were really designed to have more strong down the road effects. So one of the challenges of designing sanctions against Russia is that Europe depends a lot on energy resources from Russia. And so you don't want to sort of be shooting yourself in the foot by putting in place sanctions against Russia when you need to buy oil and gas from Russia. So a lot of it was sort of designed to kind of be backloaded and have kind of long-term effects on Russia. But there were a fair number of significant upfront effects as well. And that was meant to sort of exact a cost against Russia. That is, deny them the benefits to which they'd otherwise be entitled, which is full membership in the international economic community. It was also kicked out of G8, now the G7. So there were a number of sanctions put in place against Russia to outcast it for its behavior. But it is difficult to outcast big states like that, powerful states, nuclear states with big military. So we talk a little bit about the too big to outcast problem in various ways in which you can kind of overcome it through collective action. Really what it requires is as many states as possible to join in those sanctions as you can get. And unfortunately, in that case, what happens is China comes in and buys the oil that everybody else is refusing to buy from Russia, and so undermines the sanction to some degree. There are a number of states, too, that it's, we also talk about the difficulty of states that are effectively voluntary outcasts. So like North Korea, pretty cut off already, like kind of hard for U.S. to sanction them anymore. Like we don't do a whole lot of business with them. And so, like, one thing that's interesting about outcasting is it's kind of like it's not an infinitely powerful tool. Like, at a certain point, you run out of things that you can outcast them from. If they're not part of the global community, if they're not benefiting from being a part of, the trade regime and interacting with the rest of the world, you can't really take that away from them. And that is one of the limits of outcasting. And that's why we see the limits of our ability to have an impact on North Korea. Like, that's just the reality of the fact. We can't do as much.
But that's not different from any other form of governance in the sense that if you have, a sovereign state with a police force there's a certain amount of rogue activity that takes place, whether it's, isolated defiance of law or transnational organized crime. I mean, the fact that your enforcement mechanism is imperfect only means we're dealing with human systems, I think.
I'm so glad you say that, because it's so often the case that, people are like, well, international law was broken this one time, and therefore all of international law is kind of like, we assume
I gotta say, as somebody who used to make arguments like that when I was young and childish, I have to say the miracle is that you can get on an airplane and it can take off in one country and land in another country.
Yeah.
And every time you do that, you are benefiting by international law, because there is some treaty regime that is allowing that to happen. And when you make phone calls and they're answered in one country and made in another country, you're connecting via telecommunications regimes that are not simply telecommunications technical protocols, they're international law regimes. And when you trade and you don't pay tariffs at the exorbitant levels that we had them, only relatively recently, you're benefiting from a different international law regime. And I just think the argument that international law isn't law is just wrong. It's like, you can argue all day about why it works and what the mechanisms and to what extent. I mean, the argument that you would have with Jack Goldsmith and Kurt Bradley, who argue that it's really a reflection of state interest and nothing more. Okay, that strikes me as a reasonable argument. But the idea that it doesn't exist is just farcical.
I'm so glad you say that, and I'm gonna record this and play it back for all the doubters and the haters out there. Yeah, I mean, you're completely right. I mean, I think part of it is that so much of it is invisible. We take it for granted because it's such a part of our lives. You put a stamp on a letter and mail it to your friend in London. That's international law too, right? So it's all around us in ways that we just don't really fully appreciate.
And I also think the other factor is that when it's working at its best, it never gets understood as international law. It gets understood as the implementing legislation of the country in which you happen to exist. So if you torture somebody, you are not going to be prosecuted under the Torture Convention. You're going to be prosecuted under 18 U.S.C. 2241.
Right.
And no one's going to say, and by the way, that statute is implementing legislation for U.S. obligations under the Torture Convention. But it is.
Yes, that's right.
And so you have this perception of you're functioning under U.S. law, which you are.
Right.
And, but the U.S. law exists because of an international law requirement that we are complying with.
100%. 100%.
Yes.
That's exactly right. I love this. This is great.
Yes.
And I actually think that even if you were to say that international law is just a product of state self-interest, you still would come up with a very robust regime of international law. And I think actually, so Kurt Bradley and Jack Goldsmith are now my co-authors. So, we write together a lot now. I like to think that they've come around on this, and maybe they think I've come around. But yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I think that states create those because it's in their best. I mean, it is in their best interest. They create robust international legal regimes because, I mean, this is part of the insight that Scott and I were trying to build on, but all my work has really tried to build on is international law isn't about doing something that's not in the state's best interest. The whole point of international law is to have a tool for achieving what's in the state's interest. It just happens to be that lots of times you can best achieve what's in the state's interest by doing it in a collaborative and cooperative way. And sometimes international law is the best way to do that. And yeah, that's core to understanding how international law works. And so this whole idea that international law is somehow against U.S. sovereignty, which is sometimes you hear this idea of it's undermines U.S. sovereignty. And like, it's the opposite of that. International law is about actually creating tools for us to achieve what's in the best interest for the United States. It's not undermining what's in the best interest of the United States. It's quite the opposite. And understanding it, that what you just said, is just crucial to being able to actually use this tool in ways that are really productive and good for Americans.
Quick correction. I said 2241. The torture statute is actually 2340A. 2241 is the aggravated sexual abuse statute. Christopher, you have, I just don't like being wrong. Christopher, you have one more question, which
yes.
I have declined to ask myself because I wanted to defer to you on it.
All right, thanks so much. So we've had Stephen Wertheim on the show, Oona, and I think at some point during Pugilism Week, we wanted to try to get you to debate him on this point about the idea that if you don't just control for wars of conquest or territorial exchange, he would say that wars have increased in the post-World War II or post-Cold War era, whereas your guys' data pretty clearly shows that it decreases. So I just sort of like you to respond to his criticism or his counter argument.
Yeah, so there are a few things to say. So we're really focused on whether the thing that Article 2.4 is trying to prevent works, right? So what 2.4 is about is prohibiting states from using force against one another. And so it's prohibiting international armed conflicts. And there's no doubt that has significantly fallen during the post-45 era. And the that since that norm has been in place, it has been remarkably successful. And the thing that we document in the book is also conquest, which is the natural follow-on from that, has fallen dramatically. What we acknowledge, and we have a whole chapter called "Why Is There Still So Much Conflict?" That's literally the title of it. Is that just because you've actually succeeded in reducing international armed conflict doesn't mean you've stopped all wars. Actually, what you've ended up doing is there's been an increase in what political scientists refer to as intrastate conflict. So wars inside states. And we try to talk a little bit about why we think that's happened and actually why the success of the prohibition on wars between states might actually even have helped fuel the increase in wars within states. So I'm not sure we actually necessarily disagree as much as maybe it might look like on the surface. We're just saying the thing that they were trying to prevent, wars between states, has mostly been prevented. Not entirely, not 100%, but mostly. But there's nothing in the charter that prohibits wars within states, and a lot of those have gone up. And there's lots of reasons to think about why that might be the case.
Can I just add a couple nuances to this question? Because
yeah,
I think the debate is large. I've been thinking about this because of the French Village show that I've been watching and doing a podcast about. The concern of the internationalists, as you call them, was preventing giant wars of territorial acquisition that caused, for example, Germany to invade France and take it over.
Right.
Wars of territorial acquisition, notwithstanding Crimea and Donbass and little stuff around, just don't happen anymore. Right.
And which is remarkable, right?
I mean, like
look at human history. There's never been a time in human history where that has been, where like geographic control has been as stable as it is. Like never, right? So that it is like a totally remarkable thing, and we don't take it for granted because that's the world we live in.
It seems to me the better argument for Stephen Wertheim would be the following. It's an argument he doesn't make, which is that actually that decline, Oona and Scott can say whatever they want, but that decline was caused by the nuclear umbrellas of the United States and the Soviet Union and the sort of dual hegemonic and it has nothing to do with Article 2.4 or the UN structure. It has everything to do with the sort of bifurcated nature of world power, and the same forces that led to that led because these two countries knew they couldn't attack one another without dusting the world. So what did they do? Well, they funded each other's insurgencies around the world. You get the Sandinistas and Fidel Castro, and you get, coups in South America and in Iran and Afghanistan. And so the same forces that lead to a decline in interstate war, particularly of territorial acquisition, lead to a rise in kind of proxy fights. And none of this has anything to do with international law. It has to do with the relative deterrent stability of nuclear standoffs. And so Stephen doesn't make this argument. I think it's a much better argument than the one he makes. So let's imagine that he makes it. How do you respond to that as an alternative explanation for the pattern you describe, which I think is unambiguously true?
Yeah. So on the nuclear question, we get this a lot, so like, isn't it just nuclear weapons? And I guess a couple of answers to that. One is, well, there was a period of time where the U.S. had sole control over nuclear weapons. And in the past, if a country had had that kind of control, it would have used it for massive territorial expansion. Like, it would have taken it over lots of territory. And what does the U.S. do? Instead of taking over significant territory, it actually gives everything back. It was motivated in significant part by this set of views about what is legally required of it. And so it wasn't the nuclear weapons, we argue, that was really doing the work. It's these legal norms, and the nuclear weapons are then being used to reinforce those and those legal norms. On the rise of civil wars, interstate wars, and also wars fueled by states basically funding insurgents in other states, we don't disagree with that. In fact, again, we have a whole chapter where we say that's actually a rising problem. To say that wars between states are declining doesn't mean that like all problems are over. We've got this rise in wars within states, which are really devastating. And part of the problem, and something I've worked a bit on, is that we don't have any rules, or we have inadequate rules for holding states to account for the things that groups that they fund do. So the law of state responsibility is, I think, inadequate. And so states can fund groups and actors within other states to do all kinds of terrible things they couldn't do directly. And that's a problem. And as an international lawyer, one of the answers I have is we need laws about that. So it's not that the rules that we have, it's not the UN Charter is a problem. It's just that we haven't solved this other problem that has come along that we ought to have rules about. That's my view of it.
Richard Wattenbarger doing his best impersonation of Daniel, backlit with a dark shirt against a dark couch. It's very impressive.
He's wearing a blue and white shirt, Ben.
It's not very
you
dark.
Look great.
Everything looks dark when you're that backlit.
Yeah.
But,
believe me, I know.
Thanks. I just started reading this book a few days ago, The Internationalists a few days ago, and I can already tell that this is a book that's going to change the way that I think about some things, and it also is giving me discipline envy, because it just makes me wish I were 30 years old and I could. 30 years old and I could go back and start over again. But anyway, but one of the things I wanted to ask about is actually stylistic. And one of the things that struck me was that the very rich descriptions of events that you begin each, at least the first two chapters with. And it's not at all what I was expecting in a great sense, actually. And so I'm wondering why you decided to begin with chapters where you use such rich storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, we were trying to write a book that people might want to read. and like we do a lot of professors, we do a lot of writing articles that, that I wouldn't say are page turners. And so when we set out to write this
Don't
book,
let Bruce Ackerman hear you say that. Sorry.
I know. He and I've written one of those articles together, actually.
I know. I'm just teasing. I like Bruce's writing.
He's actually a very good writer, and he writes a lot of books. But I think Scott and I aspired, like we figured if we're writing a book, one of the reasons to write a book is you can reach a different audience. And if you want to try and reach a different audience, you want to write so that people can read it and actually find it enjoyable. So we were trying to do something that was fun to read, and we were also trying to do something that was serious. And that was a challenge. So it took us 6 years to write the darn thing. But yeah, I'm glad to hear you enjoyed it. That's great.
We have referred to Daniel, and now we invoke him. Here he is.
Look, he's not even backlit.
He's not even backlit. Yeah.
None of the tropes are in play.
He did this just to frustrate me.
Yeah.
So I'm going to return to a topic that I've asked previously about on this show, and I'm just wondering your thoughts on the current tensions between the United States, Taiwan, and China, and the implications for the international order given these tensions.
And I will just use this occasion to announce that tomorrow on Lawfare Live, we have the great Julian Koo, who will be addressing exactly this issue for an hour and taking all kinds of questions from you guys. So please do join us on that for that.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to answer that, and that's interesting to have a whole session on it. I mean, in some ways, this is a part of a longstanding tale of relations between U.S. and China. And actually, the book does talk a little bit about this because we talk about the fall of Chiang Kai-shek and his fleeing to Taiwan and the misjudging of America, because the U.S. was actually the one that insisted on the Chinese seat on the Security Council, not realizing that the government was about to fall and that it was fleeing to Taiwan, and that the government that was going to be eventually holding that seat in the Security Council was not the government of Chiang Kai-shek, but was the government of this Communist Revolutionary Party. This has been a problem that's been happening for a long time. It keeps flaring up and then dying down. I was honestly very scared during the final days of the Trump administration that this would be a moment. If China was going to act, it wouldn't have been a bad time to do it. We were so kind of navel gazing and worrying about our own our own troubles here at home. It would have been a difficult thing to respond to a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. And I have to say, I breathed a big sigh of relief when we got to January 20th without that happening. And I think the fact that we're back to this kind of what has been a long time simmering kind of hostility, but not outright conflict, is probably where we're going to be for a long time to come, I suspect.
Just a note, I posted in the chat a wonderful little piece by Matt Waxman on Lawfare a couple years ago, in which Matt dug up the authorization for use of military force that Congress passed in the 1950s to give Dwight Eisenhower the authority to use whatever military force he wanted to defend Taiwan, which was, of course, then called Formosa, and which is still in effect today and has never been repealed. Talk about aged ASUMFs that Congress never bothers to take off the books. The Taiwan AUMF is still there, and if you think that other ASUMF are broadly worded, just check this one out.
So I thought that was one that was withdrawn, but I may be misremembering it, because we did also have a mutual defense treaty, and the mutual defense treaty was withdrawn by Carter. And we've had this debate lately about like lingering AUMFs because all this talk about withdrawing, getting rid of the 2001 and 2002 AUMFs, and then people are like, wait a minute, There is the Middle East AUMF from the 50s. That one's still on the books.
I see. Maybe I misremembered the article that I had thought it was. Oh, Congress eventually repealed it 20 years later. I'm sorry. In the list
you were
of things.
Testing me. You were testing me.
Well, I'm just going to get things wrong and see how many you correct.
The reason that I disappeared, Oona, was like I have to like come up. Like I'm like redrafting all of my tests for my final exams for property and like info privacy, and I had to take a call from my dean, and we were like talking about it at the end, and we're just like, all we're doing this weekend is like writing our exams, and it's just like how brutal it is. It's like, I know it's brutal to take an exam, but it certainly takes more time to write and grade an exam than it does to take an exam. It's just, it's so awful. Anyways, Ben was testing you.
John Bordeaux, you get the last question tonight before the bonus Scott Shapiro dishing section of the show.
Thanks. I appreciate that. I think my favorite of these shows are when I don't understand 40% of what's being talked about. This qualified. Thank you very much. There's been someone asked in the chat if there's going to be graduate credits awarded for this evening, and I second that. I think it's required. So I apologize. I haven't read your book yet. I will get the U.S. version because I'm stuck here.
Awesome.
It seems to me, and I'm not a lawyer, that the enforcement measures we use in international law, such as sanctions, always fall on the population more than the government. The government can, kind of shelter themselves from natural effects. And the previous administration seemed to embrace that and say, yes, we're doing that intentionally for regime change. So now we're left in the place where there's a clear message from this country that we use international law in defense of Western interests, which is basically to replace your government if we think it's too autocratic or not going along with us. How do we counter that going forward? Have we just lost any sort of, an immoral stand?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, that is one problem. And then the other problem is that the last administration also used sanctions against, for instance, the International Criminal Court judges and prosecutors. So used sanctions are supposed to be used for violations of international law against the very institutions of international law. I mean, I think the only way to fight this is through consistent messaging and trying to chart a different course. But I do think I wrote at the time, I thought that these were bad moves because it undermines a tool that's really essential to the effectiveness of international law. And that is really, I think, dangerous and bad for those of us who believe that international law generally is a force for good in the world.
So
that reminds, sorry, I really want to.
Okay,
we have to wrap up. I know, but I really quickly want to say that I went to law school at Georgetown, and they require an international law course to graduate. And I took mine with Julie Rose O'Sullivan, who taught an entire course about the ICC. I just yes. Anyways, I have so many thoughts about the ICC in the context. If it was what I didn't realize was that the ICC is a weird integration into it's a weird entree into international law. So does that make sense? So
totally.
Yeah, and so I was like, is this international law? Because this is effed up. I'm like, I don't understand. This sounds like colonialism. I don't understand what's happening. But anyways, it was a super, for another day, we will have you back on.
I'm happy to come back and talk about that another day. It's actually one of the few things I think Scott and I might not perfectly agree on too. So you get us to come on and argue about it, although I'm not sure.
Pugilism week.
Yeah.
This is what we're going to...
Yeah, let's fight about the International Criminal Court in Rwanda. Let's do that. That sounds like a great idea.
I will just say about the more eccentric attempts in international law that, there are people who want to overuse the criminal law for things that the criminal law is not good for. And there are people who want to make everything justiciable in civil litigation, which is also not a good idea. But nobody says there's no such thing as criminal law, or that criminal law is kind of a fraud.
Right.
And the stupid thing about our debate about international law is this, and having participated in some of the stupidity when I was young and stupid. I understand where people are coming from about it, because there is a community that wants to use international law to erode, to normalize a whole lot of things that states will reasonably want to do differently from one another. And so I totally get it.
Yeah.
But it's analytically wrong to say that there's not international law. It's just not true.
I so agree, and I love hearing you say that. That just makes me so happy. You just made my week.
There you go.
So
all right,
great.
So here's before we wrap, we got to ask the Scott Shapiro question. So Scott has this persona in which he pretends to be the most erudite, stupid person in the world.
Oh, you mean his Twitter persona?
Well, there's the Twitter persona, but he also comes on in lieu of fun in that role and gives a PowerPoint presentation about his, thought about whom he's going to vote for, and weighs the pros and cons, and explains to people that unless it's framed as a trolley problem, he really can't understand it. And then there's an element.
Yeah, right. You laugh. Yeah. So do we. But are we idiots?
There's an element of the persona where he's, trolling people. Like, I have this game with him where we troll Rick Grinnell together.
Yes, I've seen.
Which I know what I'm doing in that, but I don't quite know what he's doing. So here's the question. Yeah. How much of that persona is actually the Scott? And how much of it is like a, like Sarah Silverman has the public Sarah Silverman, and then, who she really is.
I think that he is trying to sort of turn everything on its head a bit. Like, it's not like, I'm sure you've met him. He's not like that so much in person.
I've never met him in person, by the way.
But what I think what is interesting about Scott is he doesn't take anything for granted. Like, everything, he doesn't assume anything is true until it's proven. And so I think part of it is like he's willing to entertain the absurd as if it was real, and sort of think through what it would mean if the absurdity was actually real.
So I want to introduce like another way of thinking about what Scott does, and I just dropped it in the chat, which is the Dungeons and Dragons various alignments of how people align themselves. And there are law versus chaos on one thing, which are kind of categorized as lawful, neutral, and chaotic in Dungeons and Dragons games, and good versus evil, which is good, neutral, and evil. And I think that I am a chaotic neutral. Like, I just like throwing things out there and just like
see what happens,
fucking with the status quo and seeing what happens. And I'm not like, I really don't mean ill, but I don't necessarily mean good either. And I think that Scott Shapiro is a chaotic neutral also.
That's yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
Yeah.
Well, he's also kind of trying to turn everything on its head. Like, embrace the absurd and then show its absurdity by embracing it.
Right.
And yet when you write with him, when you write the Internationalists, he's not trying to
no.
troll.
This is not like his Twitter feed. No.
Right. I mean, he's capable of turning it off and just. But when he does his podcast on, jurisprudence, which by the way is fabulous.
Yeah.
It's also hilarious and eccentric.
Yeah.
And so the thing I can't figure out entirely is when the persona is on and when it's off.
Well, that's part of the fun, right? He that's exactly what he's like trying to. He's trying to keep you guessing, and given like the reactions he sometimes gets in his Twitter feed, people really have not figured out how to tell which is which.
Yes,
no one gets more mansplained to than Scott Shapiro.
And he deserves it a lot of the time, but mostly by people who don't really understand what he's up to, and That's part of what he loves, you know.
We are going to leave it there.
Yeah.
Oona Hathaway, you're a great American. It's great to see you and hear your voice.
I'm sorry I had to disappear for part of the show, but this was already so informative, and this is just so great to see you. So thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. It's so much fun, and happy to do it anytime. So
we will take you up on that, because we are still not allowed to have fun, and as long as we are not allowed to have fun, we have to do things in lieu of fun.
Yeah.
Tomorrow we will be back with Walter Schaub. It is kind of amazing that we have not had Walter Schaub on before, but that will change tomorrow, 22 hours and 50 minutes from now. And until then, Kate?
We're not allowed to have fun anymore, but in lieu of fun, we can have Dungeons and Dragons alignments as a new kind of astrology, I think.
And many fewer international wars between
And
states.
Many fewer international wars. So many fewer.
And yes, Bob Herzog, the next time we have
they're going to both be here.
Pugilism Week, we are totally having the Scott versus Oona.
I'm claws out for ICC, Oona and Scott. I also have I just have the strongest feelings about this, and so I've never gotten to get them out anywhere because this isn't my area, and I would love to hear this. So we're gonna have to do this.
Yeah, let's do it.
Super fun.